On days of our lives, death is rarely the end. Sometimes it's just a pause. And right now, one of the most emotional questions in Salem is being quietly dragged back into the spotlight. Is Abigail DiMera really gone? Or is her return already being set in motion? This isn't just wishful thinking from fans. It's coming straight from the show itself. From crypt discoveries, to carefully written dialogue, to choices the writers didn't make when they had the chance. All signs are pointing in one unsettling direction. Today we're breaking down the shocking clues, the deliberate misdirection, and why Days of Our Lives may be preparing the ground for one of its most powerful reunions ever. Is Abigail a ghost of the past, or a miracle waiting to return? The spark didn't come from an explosion, a scream, or a dramatic reveal. It came quietly. In the December 12th episode, Days of Our Lives delivered one of its most emotionally loaded moments underground, inside the DiMera crypt. Chad DiMera looks at the bones that have been discovered and voices the fear he's never allowed himself to fully confront, that they could belong to Abigail. This moment matters not because Chad considers it likely, but because he considers it possible. And that distinction is everything. Chad doesn't brush the idea aside. He doesn't argue against it. He doesn't tell himself it's ridiculous. He fears it, because Abigail's remains were never found. There was never a body to bury, never a moment of certainty. Never the kind of closure that allows grief to truly settle. For Chad, the bones in the crypt don't feel like a mystery being solved. They feel like judgment, a moment where fate might finally decide whether the hope he's carried for years was instinct or self-deception. If those bones were Abigail's, it wouldn't just confirm her death. It would erase the last fragile thread Chad has survived on. And then Theo steps in. He approaches the situation with logic instead of emotion. He examines the remains, he remembers anatomy, and based on their structure, Theo determines that the bones appear to belong to a male. The reaction that follows is subtle and devastating in its own way. Chad feels relief. But not peace, not resolution. Relief that his worst fear hasn't come true, paired with the knowledge that nothing has truly been answered. Because this relief doesn't close a door, it keeps it open. And that's where the scene becomes far more than a plot point. Because if Days of Our Lives truly wanted to end Abigail's story, this was the perfect moment. They could have confirmed the bones were hers. They could have forced Chad into finality. They could have ended years of speculation in one stroke. Instead, the show does something far more deliberate. It raises the question, and then pulls it back. Not to end the story, but to remind us it's still unresolved. Soap operas don't tease unresolved deaths without intention, and Days of Our Lives is especially strategic when it comes to legacy characters. Abigail DiMera is not a footnote in the show's history. She is a cornerstone. She is central to Chad's emotional identity, a fan favorite whose absence still defines multiple storylines, and one half of one of the most beloved love stories the show has ever told. So when the writers deliberately avoid confirming her death, even when the narrative hands them a perfect opportunity, it sends a clear message. This storyline was not designed to close Abby's chapter. It was designed to preserve it. By briefly suggesting that the bones in the crypt could be Abigail's, the show forces viewers to remember something crucial. Abigail's fate has never been settled. And by having Theo immediately shut that possibility down, the writers do something very specific. They reopen the question without answering it. Just enough to keep it alive. This is classic Days storytelling. The show carefully reminds its audience of three undeniable facts. Abigail's body was never recovered. Her death was never proven beyond doubt, and Chad has never emotionally let her go. That combination is not accidental. It's positioning. It places Abigail back into the narrative without bringing her on screen. It recenters her importance without committing to a reveal. And it subtly signals that her story still has value. This isn't about nostalgia or fan service. It's about story architecture. And that architecture becomes even more significant when you look at Chad's current emotional state. His inability to fully move on, his unresolved grief, and his continued emotional attachment to a woman the show refuses to definitively lay to rest. In Days of Our Lives, when closure is withheld this deliberately, it's rarely because the story is over. It's because the story is waiting. Chad DiMera didn't stay frozen in grief. He tried to move forward, and that distinction matters. He allowed himself to open up to Stephanie Johnson, a familiar presence, someone who represented stability and emotional safety after years of chaos. Later, he formed a deeper, more intense connection with Kat Green, a relationship rooted in mystery, tension, and emotional complexity. On the surface, it looked like progress, but beneath it, something remained unchanged. Neither relationship filled the space Abigail left behind. Because Abigail wasn't simply Chad's wife. She was his emotional center, the person who understood him in a way no one else ever has. She saw both sides of Chad DiMera, the darkness that came with his family name, and the man desperately trying to be better than it. Abigail didn't demand that Chad erase his past. She helped him live with it. And that kind of connection isn't replaced. It's carried. Every relationship Chad has had since Abby has felt provisional, not because Chad is incapable of love, but because his heart never truly left her. And Days of Our Lives consistently reinforces that truth. Every time Chad faces emotional conflict, every time he confronts loss or uncertainty, every time the past resurfaces in his life, the narrative always bends back toward Abigail. That's not coincidence. That's intention. It's character design. And it keeps Abby present in Chad's story, even in her absence. Now let's talk about the detail that quietly changes everything. Connor Floyd is scheduled to make his debut as Chad DiMera in April 2026. Recasts in daytime drama don't happen casually, especially not for a character as emotionally layered and narratively central as Chad. A recast is never just about continuity. It's about opening new narrative doors. And one of the most powerful stories available to a newly recast Chad is Abigail. A shock return, a long-awaited reunion, a love story reintroduced through a fresh emotional lens. The timing surrounding this shift is impossible to ignore. Right now, the show is revisiting the DiMera crypt. Right now, it's reopening questions about Abigail's fate. Right now, it's reminding viewers that Chad never found closure. And next year, a new Chad steps into Salem. That alignment isn't accidental. It's groundwork. A recast allows the writers to explore a reunion without being constrained by past performance dynamics. It creates emotional reset while preserving narrative history. And It gives the audience permission to see Chad's reactions with new intensity. This doesn't guarantee Abigail's immediate return, but it strongly suggests that Days of Our Lives is preparing the landscape for a story that requires emotional reinvention. And few stories demand that more than Chad and Abigail. When soaps recast a character right before revisiting unresolved love, it's rarely coincidence. It's preparation. Naturally, fans are asking the biggest and most emotional question of all. Will Marcy Miller return as Abigail DiMera? And the honest answer is, maybe. But here's the truth many viewers overlook. Days of Our Lives does not need Marcy Miller's return to bring Abigail back into the story. That's not a dismissal of her impact. It's a recognition of how soap operas work. The show has recast major legacy characters before, successfully, and often at moments when emotional continuity mattered more than physical continuity. Because with characters like Abigail, the power doesn't come from the face alone. It comes from the history, from the shared trauma, from the unfinished love, from the emotional weight that has never been resolved. If Marcy Miller returns, it becomes a miracle moment, a payoff years in the making. But if she doesn't, a recast Abigail could still deliver something just as powerful, especially when paired with a newly recast Chad. In fact, a recast can sometimes do what a return cannot. It allows the story to move forward without being trapped by the past. It gives both characters emotional permission to rediscover each other. And it reframes the reunion not as nostalgia, but as resolution. Because this storyline isn't about shock value. It's about closure that has been denied for years. And whether that closure arrives through a familiar face or a new one, the emotional impact remains the same. Before Clyde Weston slipped into a coma, he left behind a line that many viewers dismissed at the time. A chilling hint that Abigail might still be alive. Back then, it felt like manipulation, like cruelty, like Clyde playing psychological games with Chad for his own twisted satisfaction. But Days of Our Lives has a long history of doing something very specific, turning throwaway dialogue into future truth. Clyde knows how Salem operates. He understands how disappearances can be staged, how deaths can be faked, and how secrets can survive in the shadows for years. He's not a man who speaks without intent. Which raises an uncomfortable question. What if Clyde wasn't lying? What if that line wasn't meant to torture Chad, but to prepare the audience? In Days of Our Lives, warnings often arrive long before explanations. And when villains speak in half-truths, it's usually because the full truth would be too dangerous to reveal too soon. Clyde's words may not have been a threat. They may have been foreshadowing. So where does all of this leave us? With unanswered questions, with deliberate silence, and with a storyline that refuses to stay buried. Days of Our Lives had multiple opportunities to end Abigail DiMera's story. It chose not to. Instead, it keeps circling the same unresolved truth. If there's no body and no certainty, the story isn't over. Abigail may be gone, or she may be waiting. But one thing is undeniable. Chad DiMera never let her go. His life has continued. His relationships have changed. But his heart has remained anchored to a woman the show refuses to definitively lay to rest. And in Salem, love like that doesn't fade into memory. It returns. Sometimes quietly, sometimes shockingly, sometimes when no one is ready. So the real question isn't if Abigail comes back. It's how. A ghost of the past? Or a miracle stepping back into the light? Stay tuned, because on Days of Our Lives, the dead rarely stay gone. And this story feels far from finished.